Hey folks, welcome back. I'm here with my May reflections, but before we get started, I want to just take a moment to mention my sweet, smiley leopard gecko Jagger, who was put to sleep last week. And with Jagger, whilst every pet has a unique personality, his in particular was very different to any of our other Leos. He was incredibly interested in humans. He loved to engage with us and was just the softest soul. His health turned from something that we could medicate to something that was no longer the case, and last week his body was really failing him. So despite my very selfish desire to cling to him, as soon as the vet confirmed there was nothing further that could be done, we rushed him there for an emergency appointment. When he took a very quick turn, we ensured that he could pass. And the reason that I start with this is really to say that the end of my month is heavy with this, and for all the other feelings that I encompassed in it, I won't lie and say that I am finding those easily accessible at the moment, because I'm not. I'm pretty fucking heartbroken, and a lot of our month was spent tending to him, hoping he would get better, some days thinking he was, others worrying, just many vets visits, many meds. So I've been pretty foggy brained and just more forgetful than usual, to be honest, quite noticeably so, and kind of bouncing between really heavy expressions of grief and then just sheer distraction techniques and compartmentalization to really just allow my body some moments to attempt some recoup, because the grief in particular has really intensified my pain conditions. And yeah, obviously I've still needed to function. So let's jump straight in with my cards and rune of the month. And as always, we've got the 𝗵𝘁𝗍𝗄 Tarot, the Memento Mori Oracle, and one of my 𝗵𝘁𝗁𝗍𝗄 runes. So this is 𝗵𝘁𝗁𝗍𝗄. And then I've got the 𝗵𝘁𝗀𝗄 from the Memento Mori, and the Knight of Wands from 𝗵𝘁𝗍𝗄 Tarot. I would say, you know, as the rune being like the breath of life meets a rune of communication in more of a literal sense, but then magical, you know, internal and external communication. I've been doing a mixture of kind of a lot of breath work, actually, some brief chanting and some sound singing instead of like actual lyrical singing, which I prefer and can actually carry a far better tune. I was incorporating some Adderstone and breathwork into an evening ritual that I did every night throughout May, as I said goodnight to Jagger and of course Rogue. Otherwise, the cards and the rune, the way that I worked with them, I suppose I offered rather more time for slow communicative responses, because circumstantially shit was just changing very quickly throughout the month, including where I was emotionally or mentally and what I needed to be doing. So I really didn't want to be any more reactive than absolutely humanly possible or realistic. And I really tried to serve myself and the few around me in a different way. I am aware of the links to Odin through this rune in particular, so I did focus more on offerings and active engagement with Odin, but mostly he was felt in moments and synchronicities, nothing that perhaps would seem profound to anyone other than me, but that's often the case. And honestly, parts of it I like to reserve, you know, a fair amount of privacy anyway. But predominantly I came away with the invitation to find a new rhythm again, because I've been trying to move in old ways that really don't serve my body, and that has slowed me down again. So flexibility has been a factor, trust reared its head, you know, and just trying to lean into doing what feels good and communicating why, not to explain myself, but state my space and where I'm at. When it kind of came into the night in particular, I feel like the expression of them has been quite subdued in my experience this month, as I sort of energetically tried to tie up loose ends and just kind of decide where I wanted to redirect the energy, if at all. Plus, I have felt rage, like broken fragments just piercing my insides, and it's another reason why, in conjunction with this, I felt like the power was consistently serving as like a reminder to water down the fire. I suppose in a kind of temperance way, but more like mundane and accessible. I really didn't want to spark a metaphorical wildfire, which I really felt the capacity and occasionally the desire for. So I was quieter, with more internal communication, and like I said, okay, it's been subdued, so it's perhaps to some it might seem like a restrictive expression of the night, but to be honest, I wanted to hermit and hide away, which I haven't entirely because I simply can't do it. It's not realistic, it's not been a space that I can do so, and so I've managed this out of need. And there's been some moments of laughter, of course, especially before, but some of those ups and downs felt very night-like, you know, they felt less smooth. And again, like I said, I've come away feeling like rhythm was something that's really back in the fray as a need. So that's my cards and rune. Let's do a quick Patreon recap before we dive into decks and all the other stuff, because of course Patreon is a big part of what I do every month and my practice. It's a place that predominantly is an extension of my practice, even when I'm sharing experience or doing anything that would be considered like teachable content. A fair amount of that is where I'm at, what I'm focused on in the moment, because it feels like a more natural way to progress with what I offer on there. So May was the month of horse gnosis, and we explored this through magic and mundane as always, their significant impact on human life actually, and how they've aided us, so a real appreciation of this. And I created a tarot spread on some of the themes that were coming through for the month. Then I also shared some horseshoe folklore and an activation spell for my horseshoe in particular, which I took everyone through the creation part all the way up until the end, but I didn't share the actual undertaking of it because, of course, that was just for me. Some elements of trust kept coming through, so I actually shared one of my late night musings from my journal, and another facet of my practice that was running alongside this was also being really active with the Fae again. And I felt pretty ready to share my experience, a little bit of folklore, but more focused on like the Fae of my home and the land that I live, specifically immediately as well. And also the Fae decks and how I use them, because some of that is quite intrinsic to how I engage with the Fae and other parts are not. It is really quite a mishmash, and a lot of it is about intention setting before I use the deck, but also it might vary. I've got 4 very Fae or fairy focused decks, but they're very different, and we will get to showing them. So that's kind of what I've been up to there, because I'm always working away on something on my small biz, and I was actually meant to open my tarot readings by today, but I plan to do so in the coming week because, of course, things have slowed a little bit. I won't be returning to written readings, however, I'll be offering live 1-hour video sessions. So whilst it isn't open at this very second, it's something that I've been working on throughout May in the background, and it's coming. You will see it very soon. It's actually something that I already offer to folks on my Sacred Space tier on Patreon, but that is at a massively reduced cost, and so there are very limited slots. So let's get into decks. I actually, aside from a Sacred Space session I did in which it was a tarot reading, I've put the 𝗵𝗵𝗄𝗃 della Luna away for a bit, and also the demons. The demons are having their rest because I've, like I said, been very, very active with the Fae, and I don't like to split focus too far because I don't think that works very well either. As you can see, no you can't because it's cropped out. I actually have Gloominous Loom on the altar at the moment, and unsurprisingly in a very big spread where I used, what did I use? I've got some of the decks here. So I used the Memento, I used the 𝗵𝘁𝗁𝗀 and Thorn, and I used the Here and Now Oracle, and then pulled a card from the Faeries Oracle, and I did a big reading perhaps a couple of days after Jagger had passed. And yeah, I had it sitting out literally on my altar until today, in where there were so many cards I had to move it off so I could film. But Gloominous Loom really doesn't surprise me because we've hung out in these moments before. They're a very familiar little friend in particular. So let's start with the Memento. Also this month I did record the review for this deck, and it really was a love note to this as a folk witch and using it in my practice for witchery, for spirit work, just as an extension of so many things that I do. And a bit of a discussion as well on how personally I don't feel that it feels too dissimilar to osteomancy. Obviously there are some aspects that are still inherently very different, and of course with osteomancy the spirit of everything being so individual. But in terms of through this, the adaptation of the deck, and that I adapt this to be a working deck and take cards in and out of it as reflective of my practice. I don't know how anyone would use all of the cards. I do show all of the cards as one whole thing at the end of my review. I also showed a quick Instagram video of them. Is this the Memento Mori in all its glory? It is, my friends. Look at this chunk. And yeah, as you can see, it's rather large. It's not that I couldn't use it like that if I really needed to, but I use facets of it in different ways, and if you're interested then yeah, I would go and check that out. But funny enough, after I did that review, I actually went through and redid my working deck and changed out probably a good 10 to 15 cards easily. And I'm by no means the first person or the only person to do this with my deck, but certainly it's been such a consistent aspect of my craft. So there are far more layers to the way that I use this than just in a traditional reading sense. When I say traditional, I mean my go-to way of reading most commonly, just to be clear. But yeah, it's a powerhouse. It is an absolute powerhouse. I just love it so much. It's such a good deck. And then as you saw, the Here and Now Oracle has been a pretty gentle feature, and that's just because it's so spacious to use. I don't really have a lot to say about it in particular that I didn't say last month. I'm just finding it, I don't know, interesting, because there is quite an emotive layer to it, but because of the style of the words, it doesn't perhaps feel as intense as, say, the Reclaim Oracle. And I really didn't feel the need to work with the Reclaim Oracle. I was very aware of the dominant emotions that I was working through, and I didn't kind of want the reminders, whereas these felt like more directional nuances. And I've just been pulling either one a day or a couple of them with a larger spread. And yeah, I really love them. I love having them on the side in this little jar, because I've actually found that it reminds me to use it a lot more. When I pull one of these, or even if I pulled a couple, and then I wanted to come to the cards and do like a big tarot reading, which of course I don't do all the time, as many people will know, because sometimes I'm working with a reading for a really long time and I need to actually undertake a process before I'm like slinging more cards for myself. But the two things didn't even feel like they interfered with each other. Sometimes they complemented each other, sometimes they were just entirely different focuses. And yeah, I just find this to be an incredibly accessible deck for that reason. And then of course the Fae deck. So let's go to the two that feel very Fae in terms of, at least as I know it, both in Europe but also very more specifically in Britain. Fae is definitely an umbrella term, and so for me this isn't just the very fairy layer of it. There's a lot of creature nuances and yeah, just a lot more variation in these two decks. So they're both by Brian Froud. This one's in print and it's the Faeries Oracle. This one's out of print and it's Heart of Faeries Oracle. I do feel them to be incredibly energetically imbued, in particular, not just in the general animistic sense, but very just Fae imbued. And I did a massive ritual with them for the decks, and then I extended the ritual for the Fae of the house, also the Fae in the garden. So it was a whole thing. Some of it was indoors, some of it was outdoors, but I have been enjoying using these two. Now commonly I tend to use the Faeries the most, and that's not really changed. That's definitely my favourite. They have a very different feeling to them. Not so much the beings, I suppose, but certainly the nuanced approach that the decks take. Also, if you can hear the magpies, they are incredibly vocal at the moment. That's part of nature, so we embrace it in this house. But anyway, this is Tarot of the Hidden Realm, and this is the Victorian Fairy Tarot. A new version of this is was currently kickstarting. I don't know if it's finished. I'm so glad I got gifted this deck ages ago, and it's been just an absolute treasure. But it is an interesting fairy realm. I really enjoy Julia Jeffrey's artwork so much, and watching the artwork of her new deck go, you know, sort of form over the recent years has been really interesting. I find the faces and the body language to be particularly expressive in a way that really evokes something in me. It's quite a visceral experience, and many will know that that's not something I commonly have with decks that feature such people-ish looking characters, because whilst this is a Fae realm, I think I've described it before as kind of feeling like more of a meeting. And in the Victorian Fae, we know what era that was, you know, in relationship to. And whilst I love the reasoning for this relationship and how it's so freaking relevant now to like a fear of losing touch with nature and the Fae, it's very humanized. I had an interesting kind of change up of how I experienced the animals on the aces though, because originally I had experienced them merely as animals in the Hidden Realm, and then I was thinking about the shape shifting that some of the Fae have undertaken and the folklore around how they would shapeshift into certain animals, and that really has added something to the layer of the aces for me in particular. So yeah, this one feels, it feels fairy of a very certain variety, I suppose. Is not necessarily how I would represent them, but there is something about it energetically that feels like an interesting representation, that it has yeah, it just has something about it. I can't describe it, and as I say, my brain's pretty fried, so I'm not going to try to. And the Victorian Fairy Tarot is a big kind of nostalgia trip for me, in terms of a lot of the people who are around me who perhaps would never class themselves as witchy or anything of the sort, but were superstitious people. And obviously the superstitions linking to some folklore that we know and love, who really loved the Victorian fairies, the flower fairies, that whole kind of bag. So yeah, I'm really enjoying these. I don't always use them in quite the same way as the other two oracles. I will use them as supporters when I have picked, say, an oracle, and then be having a conversation with a speaker of truth through the tarot, because people know that I like to do a lot of my communicational stuff through the tarot, because I find it helps my focus and my direction, and obviously cards are a big part of my practice for many reasons. So yeah, there's one more deck, and the final deck is a grief purchase. I'm just going to call it what it is. No, these things do not fix the grief. Yes, they can become unhealthy if someone was to do it all the time. I'm very much aware of what I did, in control, comfortable with, etc. Was feeling like shit. I sold one of my tarot e-spread books, and my partner gave me the rest of the money, and I bought a deck that's probably considered a little bit out of character for me, but I have been toying with this for a very long time. And it's been on and off my wish list since it was an indie deck and now it's mass market. And that is the Compendium of Witches Oracle, which you can see. And of course it's not in order, but just to explain, there are 30 witches. They're actually called voices. They're loosely called witches in the deck. But 30 voices, and then 30 whispers, which are kind of, they feel a little bit reminiscent of the Memento Mori for me, or also the Earthbound Oracle by Skull Garden, and I will probably use those decks with this deck as well. I don't know if the big indie hardback edition of the book still exists, but I'm really curious to hear from people who have it, if they like it and what they think about it. To summarise it, I'm not really sure. Like, I like elements in the guidebook and I think it's very well put together, but I really didn't vibe with a few write-ups. It's not a huge deal and I just don't have the energy to go into why right now. I had every intention of working with the deck in the way that I, you know, naturally and intuitively did anyway. And it's not that the guidebook is rendered useless by any stretch of the imagination, not at all. And for those curious, the individuals in here, whilst there's a lot of write-up on them, which is really fascinating, you get these stories. Unlike the literary witches, these are fictional individuals, but they do have names. I think that there is a lot of potential for this deck to use it in many different ways. I've had them all together and I've only pulled one voice and then 2 whispers anyway, but I don't really mind. I'm mainly having a play with it. It's quite new to me, but one thing I will note, aside from the rest being fictional, it was really interesting because when I came across the Crossroads card, I didn't really even pay attention to the dog or anything else, or the moon. I just looked at the key around their neck and thought, that gives me 𝗪𝗪𝗃 vibes. It turns out that this is the one individual who is based on someone, and 𝗪𝗪𝗃 is named in this card in particular. which is kind of an interesting choice for otherwise characters that the creator has built themselves. But again, I don't really have any feelings about it either way. The artwork is absolutely divine. But yeah, I'm really enjoying this deck. It has a bit of a strange tactile experience. It's matte, which is lovely, but it feels ever so slightly like unglazed clay to me at the moment. I'm hoping that that will wear with use a bit. I'm quite the tactile creature, but I find that the inclusions are really lovely. Thor, Storm and Offering. It's these cards in particular, the Whispers, are very in line with my day-to-day practice. You know, a lot of it's outside, a lot of it's in nature, a lot of it is the smaller but everyday or more consecutive things that create a practice. And I really like that about it. And then I suppose I see these as invitations into archetypes, or perhaps even spirits that are showing up. It's pretty new. I've only used it a couple of times, so we're still working together. But that is my grief deck purchase, and it wasn't, whilst it was something to distract myself, most definitely, it wasn't exactly on the whim purchase either, because like I said, I've been looking at it a lot. So yeah, it's an interesting one, and one that has definitely paid off overall. And then just to catch you up with the rest, this gorgeous crystal, by the way, it's got like storms inside of it. That is the only way I can describe it. I actually bought this, it's got to be more than several months ago now, off of my friend Claire, who actually bought it off of one of her friends. So it's passed a few witchy hands now, which is really cool. But yeah, it spent May with me. So the other things that happened this month, I got a beautiful gift of bones that my dear friend, and feathers that my dear friend had been foraging from me. They're beach bones because she's quite near to the sea, and that's so cool. I've spent time with them out on the altar, anointed them, and then put them in various spaces to various uses or whatever, and the feathers have gone into my ever expansive feather collection and will be used for various things. So that was very cool, very much appreciated. Very big theme of death, as you can tell, which also I had a really interesting moth encounter. The moth wasn't dead, it's just I'd been pulling moth a lot from the Memento, whilst this moth in particular that I ended up meeting was more of a day flyer. There is a lot of discussion about moths and death and liminality in folklore again, but I'll try and put it in if the quality is manageable, because it's not it's a portrait, not a landscape. But I met a very sweet muslin moth. They're often actually confused with another species, but it depends on the body colouring and the size as well. And it was a female, because there is actually variation. So the males are this really dusky colour, like a dusky charcoal grey. And what's really interesting is the males fly predominantly at night and the females fly predominantly in the daytime. And I wonder if that's anything to do with their coloration or just, I don't know, it just interests me. But I think she was very, very fresh, which would make sense because it was May and she was down the side of our house and it was almost like a wind tunnel that day, and she was being batted around trying to dry her wings from, I imagine, recently coming out, but having a rough time of it. So before I got this video, which was when I checked that she was okay, I had her in my hands, walking through my hands, and just, yeah, allowed her the time that she needed to be somewhere safe. I would have just put her somewhere, but unfortunately we had, like, the magpies were really active in the garden, the neighbour's cat was really active in the garden. It was all going on when I just happened to walk down the side. And of course every every animal runs this risk, right? You can't just save or intervene with all of nature. But anyway, we hung out, and then when she was ready, she actually flew onto the wall herself, which was a great place to camouflage, and spent about a minute to two there and then flew off. It was really cool. I have mainly been out in the garden again a lot, just grounding, speaking with the spirits, the plants, watching the animals. I have seen all sorts of insects as well, in particular, you know, garden spiders, are they called cucumber spiders? They're really little, green, they're beautiful. What else? Woodlice, ants, so many moths of varying species. One species of butterfly, but the name escapes me. They're very light blue. Haven't seen any others at the moment, actually. I saved a 𝗻𝘂𝗺𝗺 from being squished. We've had bees, which is good. My dad bought me another French lavender plant, bless him, because my last one did not make it. So this one I've kept potted this time, although I have repotted it so that it wasn't root bound. So they've been enjoying that, and the wild geranium, which we have a plethora of in the garden. So I left a whole bunch of it for the bees. And in early May they had bluebells as well. But it's been a real moment of like deep spring before the summer hits, and I can feel it in my bones in this kind of familiar and welcome way. And I love the warmth. So even though there's been some really tough cyclical reminders, I do feel like I've been held in good company by the land and all of its residents, both the seen and unseen. Like, that's what I've felt most held by in quite a lonely month, actually, quite an isolated month, and not really necessarily by choice either. Of course, I've got my partner and we've been grieving together, but I'm also mindful of the differences of everyone's grief and making space for both of those. And then I've done some gaming, but it's been really sporadic. It's a big reflection of where I'm at, actually. I've bounced from game to game to game. I've played some Pokemon. I always forget what colour I've got, violet. I've played some Pokemon Snap. I've played some Zelda, not the new Zelda games. My partner's playing that version. Is it the Hidden Worlds? Oh, I don't know. It's a remake of an old one. I've been playing that. So yeah. Oh, I realised I didn't talk about the 𝗺𝗺𝗁𝗁. So instead of edit this in and make it look like I remembered and all that jazz, I'm just going to chuck it in at the end. This is how we roll. Like I'd said, this was also out. This is just a really easy, gentle, non-assuming deck that has animals in but doesn't feel like an animal gnosis, animal medicine, whatever you want to call it, animal messenger deck in the same capacity. It feels like an animal 𝗪𝗺𝗺 and it serves that purpose beautifully. It is a good representation of the nature that I see every day, or at least, you know, a fair amount. I always wish there was more insects, but what can I say? They're not as popular, I get it. And I mean, did I say non-assuming? It's just kind of chill. The sad cards are sad, but they're not in your face. I think that's it. Nothing's in your face. It works well with the Fae decks. It works well with all of the decks that I've been working with. And I have found it just the kind of softness that I have wanted without being... I don't know, I'm in a very particular space. I didn't want something soft that felt too affirmative, or like there was an unwillingness or an ignorance to be with where I was at. So this can do that in a very soft way, and perhaps not in the same gravity, but yeah. That's that. So that is my month. I've forgotten stuff. Like, there have been some great moments. I did a live with Martin actually on his channel. It was several days after Jagger, and so in the midst of grieving I felt in terms of like answering things, a bit disorientated, super forgetful, slow to respond. But Martin and I had fun, and with the people that attended live, and I laughed, and I needed that. I feel like sometimes it's easy to fall into taking myself too seriously when there's a big chunk of that in this community, witchy tarot and adjacent, and I am definitely one to talk about respect and reverence and just so many things that might fall into that. But, you know, I'm really recalling other aspects as well. Like, it doesn't just have to be one or the other. I'm really not into that. So yeah, I'm sure I've forgotten other stuff, but I am done. I need to rest. So thank you for hanging out with me on the recap. I hope May was, I don't know, gentle. That's what I usually say, because that's kind of a sweet spot for me. A gentle month is always a nice one. And I will catch up with you soon. Unless you want to comment below what you did in May, what you got up to, then feel free to share. And yeah, I'll be back soon.